Friends, a big loving welcome to our very own channel, Ammu&You, where I, Ammu, is so happy always to narrate lovely stories to you. Stories of all kinds. And today, the first time, I am venturing into narrating a horror short story. A horror story? Well, a story that speaks about spells and talismans. This story is named The Monkey's Paw, written by W.W.Jacobs, and it is based on an idea in which 3 wishes are granted. It's the story of a paw of a dead monkey that grants its possessor 3 wishes. But like many a times, it comes with an enormous prize. The beliefs and disbeliefs about the spells at times land us up in such an unpredictable situation that we are left with nothing but regret. This is how the paw is also described in the story, that it had a spell put on it by an old fakir. He was a very holy man, and he wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. So, the story, The Monkey's Paw, written by W.W.Jacobs. The night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. In the cozy room at night, father and son, Mr. White and Herbert White, were playing chess, and Mrs. White, white-haired old lady, was knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was really trying to distract Herbert White. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Cheque. I should hardly think that he'd come tonight," said Mr. White, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly, at a slightly, visibly upset Mr. White. "Perhaps you'll win the next time." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips as he said, "There he is," as the gate banged too loudly and heavy footsteps came towards the door. He had been waiting for someone for quite a while. The old man rose with hospitable haste and, opening the door, welcomed the visitor. "Sergeant Major Morris," he introduced the visitor to his family. The sergeant major shook hands and, taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on fire. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. "When he went away, he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now just look at him and hear about all the places that he has been to. I'd like to travel to a bit. Especially would like to go to India," said Mr. White, "just to look around a bit." "Better where you are," said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again. "I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers," said Mr. White, What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris? Nothing, said the soldier hastily. Leastways, nothing worth hearing. Monkey's paw, said Mrs. White curiously. Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps, said the sergeant major offhandedly. His three listeners leaned forward eagerly. To look at, said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket. It's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy. He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. And what is there special about it? Inquired Mr. White. It had a spell put on it by an old fakir, said the sergeant major, a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that three separate men could each have 3 wishes from it. Well, why don't you have 3, sir? Said Herbert White cleverly. Well, I have. And the sergeant major's blotchy face whitened. And did you really have the 3 wishes granted? Asked Mrs. White. I did, said the sergeant major. And has anybody else wished? Inquired the old lady. The first man had his 3 wishes. Yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was death. That's how I got the paw. His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. If you had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now, then, Morris, said Mr. White at last. What do you keep it for? Fancy, I suppose, replied the major. He took the paw and, dangling it between his front finger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. Better let it burn, said the soldier solemnly. If you don't want it, Morris, said the old man, give it to me. I won't, said his friend doggedly. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man. Mr. White shook his head and examined his new possession closely. How do you do it? He inquired. If you really wish to, well, hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud, said the sergeant major. But I warn you of the consequences. Sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? If you must wish, Sergeant Major again said gruffly, wish for something sensible. The supper was laid, everyone enjoyed the supper, and after the visitor left, the door closed behind their guest, Herbert said with pretended horror, why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact, he said slowly. It seems to me I've got all I want. If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Said Herbert, with his hand on his father's shoulder. Well, Wish for 200 pounds, then that'll just do it. His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, said distinctly, I wish for 200 pounds. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from Mr. White. His wife and son ran towards him. He cried in disgust at the object as it lay on the floor, the monkey's paw. It moved as I wished it, twisted in my hands like a snake. Well, I don't see the money, said his son as he picked it up and placed it on the table. And I bet I never shall. They sat down by the fire again while both father and son finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Herbert, as he bade them good night, and something horrible squatting up on the top of the wardrobe, watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains. He tried to make fun of the whole thing. His mother laughed, and they all went off to bed. Next morning, they greeted each other at the breakfast table. Herbert had his breakfast and was again in a jovial mood while bidding them goodbye while leaving for work. Well, don't finish off all the money before I'm back. And his mother laughingly saw him off the door. Mrs. White came back and sat in a chair. And suddenly, looking at Mr. White's face, she said, "What's the matter?" Mr. White's face was serious. He asked his wife, "Did you see something?" His wife looked out, and she was suddenly watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. Now, a good few hours had passed, and the couple was happily chatting, and suddenly this man, who the couple noticed outside, drew their attention. Mrs. White got up and, taking off her apron, came out and opened the door. The person outside was taken aback and greeted them by taking off his hat, and then, a bit uncertainly, said, "I was asked to call," stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I come from Moore and Megan's." "Why, that's where our son works," said Mrs. White. The old lady started. "Is anything the matter?" "He has left for work quite some time back," she asked breathlessly. "Has anything happened to Herbert?" "What is it? What is it?" Her husband interposed. There. Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir. And he eyed the man wistfully. I'm sorry, began the visitor. Is he hurt? Demanded the mother. The visitor bowed in assent. Badly hurt, he said quietly, but he is not in pain. Oh, thank God for that, said the old woman, clasping her hands. Thank God for that. Thank. She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath and laid her trembling old hand upon her husband's. There was a long silence. He was caught in the machinery, said the visitor at length in a low voice. Caught in the machinery, repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion. Yes. He sat staring blankly out of the window. He was the only one left to us, he said, turning gently to the visitor. It is hard. The other coughed and rising walked slowly to the window. The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss, he said, without looking around. I beg that you will understand I am only their servant and merely obeying orders. I was to say that Maw and Meggins disclaim all responsibility, continued the other. They admit no liability at all. But in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation. Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at the visitor. His dry lips shaped the words. How much? £200 was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put his hands like a sightless man, and dropped a senseless heap to the floor. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles away, everything was over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it. The days passed and expectation gave place to resignation, the hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. Come back, he said tenderly. You will be cold. It is colder for my son, said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The paw, she cried wildly. The monkey's paw. The sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start from a doze. Where is it? What's the matter? She came stumbling across the room towards him. I want it. You've not destroyed it. It's in the parlor, on the bracket, he replied. Why? She cried and laughed together and bending over, kissed his cheek. I only just thought of it. Why didn't we think of it before? Think of what? The other two wishes, she replied. We've only had one. Was not that enough? He demanded fiercely. No, she cried triumphantly. We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly and wish our boy alive again. Good God, you are mad, he cried aghast. Get it quickly and wish, oh my boy, wish him back. Her husband struck a match and lit a candle. Get back to bed. You don't know what you are saying. Go and get it and wish, cried the old woman, quivering with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook. He has been dead 10 days, and besides, I would not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now? Bring him back, cried the old woman. Mr. White went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlor and then to the mantelpiece. He had lost the direction of the door. Wish, wish, it is foolish and wicked, he faltered. Wish, and he raised his hand. I wish my son alive again. The talisman fell to the floor, and with burning eyes, he walked to the window and raised the blind. Neither spoke, lying silently, listening to the ticking of the clock. Suddenly, there was a stair creak, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. At the foot of the stairs, the match went out. He paused to strike another. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until he could hear the knock clearly. The knock was repeated. A third knock. What's that? A rat, a rat. Go back to bed. No, it's Herbert, it's Herbert. She cried to the door and she ran there. What are you going to do? It's my boy, it's Herbert. I must open the door. For God's sake, don't let it in. You're afraid of your own son? Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert, I'm coming. There was another knock and another. The old woman, with a sudden wrench, broke free and hurried downstairs. The bolt, come down and help me with the bolt. I can't reach it. While her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If only he could find it before the thing outside got in. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back. The door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him the courage to run down to her side and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp, flickering out opposite, shone on a quiet and deserted road. There was no one outside. Mr. White had had his 3 wishes. I'm sure you've loved the story, friends. It really gives one creeps. Well, please like, share, subscribe, and press the bell icon. Your comments would be always more than welcome. And thank you for watching the video and listening to the story. I will come back soon again with another one to narrate. Thank you so much. Stay safe and bye.